Most of us can hear between about 20 hertz and 15 kilohertz. Between about 20 and 40 hertz, most of us feel rather than hear. And around about 30 to 40 hertz, I think, is the lowest pitch that some people can identify as a note. When we get below 20 hertz, certainly 30 hertz, we tend to feel a rumble, and it's very, very difficult to pitch. I have great difficulty pitching anywhere near down there, which is a shame because I was a bass player for quite a long time. But basses, most basses don't go down as low as that. We have a dynamic range of around 140 decibels. That is a massive dynamic range. It's the capacity to hear, sitting in an anechoic chamber, it's the capacity to hear the blood rushing through your own ears, right through to being able to listen to fireworks going off on bonfire night. There aren't many microphones that have got that kind of dynamic range, so the ears are a pretty sophisticated piece of kit. And in order to do that, there are 4 EQ processes and 3 compressors in your ear managing this. The ear canal itself, you know when you get very, very, very short reverb, like if you, give an example, say you've got a plastic tube and you clap your hands at the top of the plastic tube, you get a kind of ring, and that ring has a pitch to it. But if you think of the ear canal as being a bit like that tube, that ear canal usually has a resonance of about 2.5–3 kilohertz, which not surprisingly is round about where speech takes place. So before the sound has even reached your eardrum, it's kind of being amplified, or like we're talking about synths, the kind of resonance in a filter. It pulls up that frequency. And that process kind of goes on throughout the hearing chain, that certain frequencies are amplified, meaning that if you stuck a flat microphone in the air and measured the frequency response of that microphone, it could be absolutely flat for a frequency sweep in the air, but by the time that has reached your brain in the terms of mechanical movement through the ear, it's anything but flat. It's been altered quite dramatically. And the compressors are the muscles that regulate the hammer. I'm not going to go into the physiology, but the kind of tiny bones inside the ear. When we're exposed to really loud sounds, these muscles tighten up and they hold these bones tighter to stop them putting too much pressure on the inner ear and potentially things bursting. Your eardrum tightens up when you're exposed to really loud sounds to reduce the amount of movement so that not too much gets transmitted through to the inner ear. If any of you have that experience where you listen to a piece of music on headphones and as you take them off, the pitch appears to drop? Yeah. Yeah? Have people heard it as well? Yeah. Some headphones seem to do it more than others, and some pieces of music are particularly susceptible to it. But the headphones don't have to be particularly loud. The theory behind it, I've heard a number of theories, but the most plausible one seems to be that as you've got the headphones on, the muscle that's holding your eardrum has kind of tightened up a little bit because it's been exposed to something fairly loud. As you take the headphones off, the level drops and the eardrum relaxes suddenly. And the brain knows about that and can compensate for it, but for a fraction of a second, it's doing that compensation. And of course, as you slacken the eardrum, it's like tuning a drum head down. Obviously, the pitch drops. So as you take the headphones off, the theory is that perception takes a little while to catch up, and initially you hear a pitch drop of about a quarter of a tone.
Is that the same as when you hear a vehicle with a siren go past and it's lower when they're going away?
That's the Doppler effect, which is slightly. You'd have to take the headphones off really fast to get, to get that effect.
You do if they're really loud, like.
Yes, yeah, and then things kind of drop down again afterwards. So there's a lot of kind of physiological and neurological processes taking place in hearing in order to kind of make sense of it. The cochlea acts as a frequency-specific compressor. The cochlea is actually the bit that starts to convert the vibrations into neurological impulses. And it's if you can imagine a long tube with a kind of flexible membrane along the bottom, and the top of the membrane vibrates at high frequencies, and the other end vibrates at low frequencies, and the nerves along this membrane pick up the triggers at different points. So basically, it's breaking the waveform down into different constituent frequencies. And if there's a particularly loud sound, you've probably also heard this, you know, if you're doing a live gig and there's a sudden blast of feedback, you lose your top end. And that's because the top end of the frequency response damps down. Actually, the membrane in the cochlea gets damped down by the hairs around it in order to protect yourself from that frequency. But the rest of the frequency might be relatively unaffected, given that feedback's often probably not a pure tone and it might spread down there. So there's a lot of kind of sophisticated stuff going on there.
I've definitely heard it with like if somebody suddenly whacks a snare drum or hits an anvil or something, it sounds this like kind of like the same as a compressor, where you hear the attack of the sound and then it.
Yes, yeah,
shuts
and then
down.
your kind of ear responds. You listen very carefully. Your ear kind of responds to that, which is like a compressor, which is one of the things I'm going to talk about a bit later on. Because a compressor kind of mimics
Yeah.
an acoustic, a kind of neurological and acoustic effect. So our EQ and perception generally is kind of tuned in to 3 octaves, around about 3 octaves, between about 500 hertz, which is maybe a little bit lower, and 4 kilohertz. We tend to, our hearing is geared to picking up information between those frequencies because we hear it more clearly. Our ear is tuned to hone in on that, to pick it up, to amplify it, and to focus on it. Now, I've got a couple of clips here. This is the same piece of music. And this is listening to the piece of music filtered at 400 hertz. So this is just what's going on below 400 hertz, as in outside that range that the ear is sensitive to. This speaker's adding some harmonics for us.
Why can you hear the tune?
Because there is the human voice has got frequencies below 400 hertz in there, so there is still, but you can't hear, what's missing is all the sounds in the voice. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, I was thinking. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was just getting confused. I know what you mean. Sorry.
So that's sub 400 hertz. What does that sound like, just out of interest?
Being in a cupboard.
Yeah, it sounds like something loud quite a long way away. Maybe the neighbour's got the stereo on too loud and you're hearing it through the floor. You know, it's that kind of sound, which is, again, we'll talk about that again a bit later on, but what we're hearing is something that's a way off. Yeah? This is a sound that's coming through a lot of air, or a lot of obstacles before it's reached us. This is just 500 kilohertz to 4 kilohertz, so the top end, the very top end and the very bottom end is taken out, and it's just left with the bit the ear is sensitive to.
See her how she flies, golden sails across the sky, close enough to touch, but careful if you try. Though she looks as warm as gold, ruins a harsh mystery.
So that's all that focuses on is the area that our ears are most sensitive. The first thing is it actually sounds significantly louder than the other piece, but that's because it's right in the area where our ears are most sensitive. We can hear the lyrics, and I don't know whether you picked it up, but actually there's a fretless bass phrase at the beginning as well, so we can actually hear bass even though we're rolling off everything below 500 hertz. We can hear the lyric, we can hear most of the kind of enunciation in the voice, not surprisingly because that's where most of the voice activity is. As human beings, our hearing is designed to pick up voices, not surprisingly, because that's what they kind of evolved to do. Not surprisingly, 500 hertz to 4 kilohertz is the area of mixes that make the difference between something that's clear and something that's a mess. And I'm kind of gratified to discover this because I've just bought a pair of NS10s, which are speakers that everybody hates or loves. That's the area that NS10s really push forward. They're not nice speakers to listen to, but they really show up that area of a mix because they don't go down particularly low, although they do go up a little bit higher than that.
What are they for then, NS10s? Are they just mixing?
They're for spotting errors, really.
Spotting errors.
I think, yeah, they're not for listening to it because they're horrible speakers. But they gain
I've got.
reputation.
Unfortunately, it's all I've got in my in my studio, which I could do with something else as well. But
Yeah, but I've heard an awful lot of people who track using NS10s because they say if you don't mess about with frequencies below the ones that they're reproducing, just leave them as they are. They're probably okay, and they will allow you to spot spitty vocals. They'll allow you to spot distortion. They'll allow you to spot too much room sound, and they will tell you if there's going to be a mistake in the mix or the mix is too middly, it will leap out of those. So they're kind of like an acoustic magnifying glass.
yeah, what I've learned is that they shouldn't actually sound nasty. If they sound nasty, it's wrong.
Yeah, and the story is if you can make it sound good on NS10s, it's going to sound good on anything. And I think there's an element of truth to that. The problem is it's very hard for anything to sound good on an NS10.
Yeah, they're hard to get used to because you do tend to make everything sound a little bit too soft.
Yeah. But when you get some good speakers, they're going to sound great. Okay, so this is this is the Fletcher-Munson equal loudness contour. This has actually been kind of updated since 1933, but these are the guys who did it originally, and I thought we deserve the credit for it. What they did was to play tones at different frequencies to people and ask them to match the volume of those tones, so they could kind of work out what impact volume and frequency has on how loud a sound sounds to a human being. Does that make sense? Because yeah, I'll explain that. Okay. So I mean, you can see it's not a straight line. Essentially, each of those lines is at a different volume level. I'll point at it. So the loudest sounds are up at the top here, and the quietest sounds are down at the bottom. And as you can see, as it gets louder, these are the low frequencies at this end of the table, these are the high frequencies at this end of the table. You can see, round about here, the dip kind of indicates that sounds do not need to be particularly loud at those frequencies to be heard loud, if you like. I'm trying to think of a way to describe it. It's kind of like, it's the difference between the sound pressure and how loud it sounds. So how much the air is moving and how loud it sounds. And at these frequencies, the air doesn't have to move very much for it to sound loud, whereas at these frequencies, the air has to move quite a lot for it to sound loud, and these are the bass frequencies. So you've got to move a lot of air to get a bass sound to sound loud when the volume is down a little bit. This is complicated. Do shout out if I haven't explained this very well, because I'm trying to explain three things at the same time. The two pieces of information I think to think about in this is that round about those frequencies described, between about 500 and 4 or 5K, we don't need to hear a lot in order for it to sound loud. The bottom end, we actually need to hear quite a lot of, it needs to be turned up quite loud for us to hear the bass. So if we look at the difference between, this is 10 decibels, isn't it? At 1 kilohertz and let's take about 100 hertz. You can see there's a big difference in the curve. A 100 hertz signal has to be quite a lot louder in order for it to sound as loud as a 1 kilohertz signal when you're listening fairly quietly. As you turn the volume up, it gets much flatter. Now, it's probably a rather long-winded and complicated way of saying you can't hear the bass when it's quiet. And this is why 70s, 80s, 90s hi-fis used to have a loudness button on them, because it's linked to the volume control. As you turn the volume control down, it lifts the bass up. To try and get a curve that starts to sound like that when you're listening down here. Yeah? Now it gives you a huge clue as to what you have to, well, how you get a mix to sound good when it's loud and when it's quiet. And the answer is you can't, because your ears don't hear the same thing when it's loud and when it's quiet. So if you're listening to a mix when it's quiet, the mid-range will come through much more clearly than the bass. As you turn the mix up, it starts to get more interesting, it starts to get more involved, the bottom end starts to become more and more prominent. And when you get particularly loud, it's great, and you can start to feel it thumping your chest, and you start to get some physical responses to the air moving as well, because we do, there are other ways of perceiving sound other than hearing. You know, if the kind of diaphragm moves, then you know there's a lot of bass around. So this tells us straight away that our mix will change as we turn it up. Without touching any faders at all, the bass will come up in the mix. The response starts to get flatter, and we'll kind of think, yeah, that's great, lots and lots of bass, then we turn it down again, and then think, oh, I can't hear the bass anymore. What's happened to that? And then you push the bass up and then turn it up again. And there's also the kind of tendency in a lot of monitoring systems that as you turn it up to get the bass to sound clearer and cleaner, some systems will start to add a bit of distortion. Speakers, you know, we talk about amplifiers being very, very good when they've got a distortion rate of kind of 0.01 or 0.001%. That's a good mic preamp or a very, very good power amp. Loudspeakers, certainly PA speakers like this, have distortion figures of about 6–8%. So as you wind a mix up and the speakers start to work louder, they're adding harmonics, they're adding sounds that are not actually there in your mix because of that kind of distortion, and it might start to sound bassy but also middly at the same time because the speakers themselves are beginning to run a little bit out of steam. So one of the great struggles in kind of dealing with mixes and wondering why they don't transfer from one place to another is actually if the volume changes, the EQ changes. And we've got something which is effectively a kind of a dynamic EQ. where the response of human hearing changes depending on how loud the sound is. And it's kind of like having a volume control and a bass control. As you turn one up, the other one goes up as well. This is it's called an EQ transfer function, which is looking at the comparison between the frequency response of a system compared to the amount of signal that's going through it. And this is what makes the ear very different from most other electrical pieces of equipment. If you add 3 decibels at 10 kilohertz on a mixing desk and push the fader up, you're still adding 3 decibels at 10 kilohertz, regardless of the level of the signal going through the desk, providing it's not distorting or anything. But your ear isn't. Your ear is starting to make other adjustments as a result. So, I haven't got the answers to this, I'm afraid, because we're stuck with these ears. It's the most vital bit of our mixing process. But being aware of it and kind of thinking, hang on, how loud am I listening? What's it doing to my hearing? How loud is the person who's going to play this going to listen to it at? And I guess the best idea is we'll mix at the level that it's going to be listened at. And then, as we see all over the place now, then you make a radio edit, and you make a club edit, and you make an iPod edit, and so on, and you make different mixes to be listened to on different systems, which an awful lot of people do now. And maybe your final one has to be somewhere between those two. Although don't do a club edit to be played on the radio, because people's speakers will fall off the wall now.